What's the story behind this $847,000 wire transfer moving from your climate fund to your boyfriend's private firm? Donald Trump's voice cut through the air as he stood behind the heavy, resolute desk, holding a bank statement. He focused his gaze on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez with the sharp precision of a prosecutor nailing a guilty defendant. There was no anger in his eyes, just a cold sense of amusement from someone holding every single winning card. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as the gravity of the situation began to crush any hope of escape. Every clever scheme, every shortcut, and every lie she had ever told was about to be dragged into the light. Ocasio-Cortez sat frozen in the guest chair, her usual aura of untouchable confidence having vanished in an instant. Her fingers clutched the armrests while her complexion turned ghostly pale, betraying her fear despite the heavy makeup. She had walked in expecting a standard debate on climate policy and a chance to perform for her social media. Instead, she had walked directly into a high-level federal ambush that she never saw coming her way at all. FBI Director Christopher Wray stood motionless against the wall, observing the scene with a cold and clinical detachment. Beside him was a woman in a sharp dark suit who would later be identified as the Bureau's top forensic accountant. That specialist had spent the last 8 months meticulously untangling every single dollar moved through AOC's complex financial web. The desk was now a mountain of evidence, piled high with bank records, wire transfers, and internal company invoices. There were documents for shell corporations and 3 years of tax returns, all painting a clear picture of massive fraud. That payment was strictly for professional consulting services, she stammered, her voice losing its characteristic sharp and progressive edge. The fiery leader who dominated cable news interviews was replaced by someone who sounded like a cornered petty criminal. Trump offered a thin predator's smile, the kind of look a hunter gives when the prey has nowhere left to run. Consulting services, you say? Your partner Riley Roberts runs an outfit called C Strategies, which is a very poetic name. But Riley is a web designer with zero background in climate science. So what exactly did he consult on for nearly $1 million? He didn't bother waiting for a response and instead tossed a fresh set of incriminating documents onto the pile. Let's skip the part where you invent a story, because the FBI already followed the digital breadcrumbs to the end. The cash hit his business account on June 15, 2024, sat there for 2 days, and then vanished entirely. On June 17th, every cent was wired to a bank in the Bahamas under a shell company called Future Holdings. Who do you think actually pulls the strings at Future Holdings? I'll give you a hint. The owner shares your initials. The blood drained from her face as her breathing became shallow and erratic under the weight of the revelation. The realization hit her like a physical strike. They had the offshore records, the wire logs, and the total truth. I need my legal counsel present for this, she managed to choke out, her voice barely a desperate whisper. You can have a dozen lawyers after we're finished, but right now, you're staying in that chair, Trump countered. I have the receipts, the footage, and the proof that you laundered millions in donor cash into your private offshore accounts. He stepped around the desk and stood over her, laying out the grim reality of her current legal standing. You have 2 paths forward. Path 1, you cooperate fully, name names, return the money, and quit your seat today. If you do that, maybe we can keep you from rotting in a federal cell for the next 20 years. Path 2, you keep lying, you call your lawyers, and I walk into the press room to announce your arrest. We will walk you out of the Capitol in chains while every news camera in the country captures your disgrace. The evidence is a mountain, and you will lose at trial, which means you'll likely spend your life in prison. Trump picked up a glossy photograph showing her at the Met Gala draped in an incredibly expensive designer gown. This dress cost 35 grand, and you paid for it using money donated by working-class teachers and nurses. They thought they were saving the world, but they were actually just funding your high-end wardrobe and celebrity lifestyle. He tossed another photo down, showing her at a five-star resort in Turks and Caicos that cost thousands per night. You claim this was a strategy retreat for the Green New Deal, but it was just you and your boyfriend. You took $17 million from people who bled for it because they believed you were actually one of them. But you aren't a socialist. You're just a con artist with a very expensive brand and a talent for lying. You bought a Miami condo and designer clothes with money stolen from the very people you claim to represent. He hit a buzzer on his desk, and two somber FBI agents entered the room to stand guard by the exit. So, what's it going to be? Are you going to tell the truth, or do I let these agents take you? She looked at the mountain of evidence, the director of the FBI, and the president who had completely dismantled her life. There was no escape, no viral tweet to save her, and no political movement that could erase these bank records. To understand how she ended up in this trap, you have to look back at the morning she received the call. It started as a routine Tuesday in February, with coffee and social media planning before the White House reached out. Her chief of staff was baffled when he delivered the news that the president wanted an immediate private meeting. AOC laughed it off at first, thinking she could use the confrontation to bolster her own political standing and fundraising. "Let him yell," she had told her team. "I'll stand my ground and turn it into great content for tonight." She had no idea that while she was prepping talking points, federal agents were finalizing the case for her imprisonment. The investigation had been running for 8 months, sparked by an anonymous tip from deep within her own campaign. Forensic experts had tracked $12.8 million in diverted funds that never went toward any actual climate or political work. They found a network of shell companies owned by her friends and family that existed only to move stolen cash. The FBI even had surveillance footage of her in the Bahamas, wearing sunglasses while opening the secret offshore accounts. Every transfer followed the same pattern. Donor money went in, sat for a few hours, and then vanished overseas. By the time she arrived at the Oval Office, the trap was set, and the evidence was completely and utterly undeniable. "The silence in the Oval Office is deafening, isn't it?" Trump remarked, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly tone. He leaned back against the mahogany desk, watching her struggle to find a single word of defense that wasn't a lie. The air felt thin, the kind of atmosphere that exists right before a massive structural collapse or a final surrender. Ocasio-Cortez looked down at her hands, which were shaking so violently she had to tuck them under her thighs. The reality of a federal indictment was no longer a distant political threat. It was a physical weight in the room. I wasn't the one who handled the technical side of the accounting," she finally whispered, her voice cracking. It was the first sign of a total fracture in her defense the moment she began looking for someone to blame. Trump chuckled, a sound devoid of any warmth, as he reached for a blue folder labeled Project Green Shadow. "That's the classic move, Alexandria. Blame the staff, blame the boyfriend, blame the system you claim to hate. But your signature is on every single one of these authorization forms, from the wire transfers to the resort bookings." He flipped open the folder to reveal a series of high-resolution scans showing her distinct, loopy handwriting on bank documents. "We have the logs from the encrypted messaging app you used to tell Riley when to move the fertilizer money. That was your code word for the donations, wasn't it? Very clever, though not nearly as clever as you thought." The FBI recovered the deleted messages from a server in Switzerland that thought its privacy protocols were actually unbreakable. Turns out, when you mess with the United States Treasury, those privacy walls tend to come down very quickly indeed. Director Wray stepped forward, his face a mask of professional neutrality, as he addressed the Congresswoman directly for the first time. "Representative, we have your Chief of Staff in an interrogation room at this very moment in a separate facility. He's not as loyal as you hoped, and he's currently trading everything he knows for a chance to avoid prison. He's detailing the kickback structure you built into your grassroots fundraising platform to siphon off the small-dollar donations. The $5 and $10 contributions from students and activists were being diverted into a private slush fund within hours." AOC felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead as the scale of the betrayal began to fully sink in. Her inner circle, the people she trusted to guard her secrets, were already cutting deals to save their own skins. She realized then that she was the only one left standing in the blast zone of this massive corruption scandal. "You can't do this. This is a political hit job," she tried to protest, but the words felt hollow and weak. "It's not a hit job when the math is perfect, Alexandria," Trump countered, tapping a finger on a spreadsheet of losses. "We tracked the climate action grants that were supposed to go to inner-city solar projects in your own district. Instead of panels on roofs, that money went toward a luxury car collection registered to a garage in Long Island. 2 Lamborghinis, a vintage Porsche, and a high-end SUV, all paid for by people who can't afford their rent. Do you know how that's going to look on the front page of the New York Post tomorrow morning? The champion of the poor, driving a $250,000 Italian sports car while her constituents struggle to buy groceries." She closed her eyes, trying to block out the images of the evidence that would soon be seen by millions. The social media following she had spent years building would turn into a digital mob within a matter of minutes. The very people who defended her online would become her harshest critics once they saw the receipts of her greed. "How did you get the Bahamian records?" she asked, her curiosity briefly overriding her terror as she looked at him. Trump smiled, a genuine expression of triumph that showed he had enjoyed every second of the secret investigation process. "The Bahamas isn't the fortress it used to be, especially when the State Department starts asking very pointed questions. We found the future holdings account, and we found the $2 million you moved there just last month. It's a shame, really. You had a bright future, a lot of talent, and a base that truly believed in you. But you got greedy, just like all the others who think they're too important to follow the same rules. You thought you were a queen, but in the eyes of the law, you're just another common white-collar thief." He walked over to the window, looking out at the rose garden while letting the gravity of his words settle. "The warrants are already signed, and the grand jury has been sitting in a basement for the last week. They've seen enough to return an indictment on 42 counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. Each one of those carries a significant stay in a federal facility, and we aren't talking about club fed either. Since this involved campaign funds and public office, the sentencing guidelines are going to be extremely harsh for you." Ocasio-Cortez finally looked up, her eyes red and brimming with tears of pure frustration and deep, agonizing regret. "What do you want?" she asked, knowing that if he wanted her arrested immediately, he wouldn't be talking to her. Trump turned back, his expression shifting from amusement to a cold, businesslike focus that signaled the start of negotiations. "I want a full confession, a resignation letter effective immediately, and a total return of every stolen cent. I want you to go on national television and tell the world exactly how you cheated your own supporters. If you do that, I might, and I emphasize might, be willing to talk to the DOJ about a reduced sentence. I'm talking about 5 years instead of 50, and a chance to eventually have a life once you get out. But if you walk out that door without signing, the agents outside will cuff you before you reach the elevator. The choice is yours: a quiet exit and a chance at a future, or a very loud, very public destruction. He pulled a single sheet of paper from his desk drawer and slid it across the desk toward her. It was a pre-written resignation letter addressed to the Speaker of the House and the Governor of New York. The language was clinical, citing personal reasons and a desire to focus on legal matters as the primary cause. She stared at the blank line at the bottom, the place where her political career would officially go to die. "My supporters will never believe it. They'll think you forced me into this," she said, clutching at one last straw. "They'll believe the bank statements," Trump replied flatly. "Numbers don't have a political bias, and neither does a prison cell." She picked up the pen, her hand trembling so much that the first stroke of her name was jagged and uneven. With a heavy heart and a sense of total defeat, she finished the signature that ended her time in power. The FBI agent stepped forward to take the document, ensuring it was witnessed and legally binding for the record. "Good choice," Trump said, taking the pen back and placing it in his pocket like a trophy of his victory. "Now, let's talk about the offshore accounts and how we're going to get that money back to the taxpayers." The meeting continued for hours, a grueling process of tracing every dark corner of her secret financial empire. She gave up names of donors who had knowingly participated in the scheme and consultants who took a cut. By the time the sun began to set over the Capitol, the radical icon was nothing more than a broken witness. She walked out of the West Wing not as a leader of a movement, but as a woman facing total ruin. The cameras were waiting at the gate, but for the first time in her life she had nothing to say. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the White House lawn, as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped out into the humid evening air. The two FBI agents trailed exactly 3 steps behind her, their presence a silent, rhythmic reminder of the invisible chains now shackling her life. Her mind was a chaotic blur of numbers, legal statutes, and the cold, mocking resonance of Donald Trump's voice echoing in her ears. She felt as though she were walking through a thick fog, the transition from powerful lawmaker to federal cooperator happening in a single afternoon. The weight of the signed resignation letter in the president's desk felt like a leaden anchor pulling her down into the depths of a dark ocean. The black SUV waiting at the curb wasn't the usual congressional transport she had grown accustomed to over her years in power. This was a government vehicle designed for the discreet transport of high-value targets, with tinted windows that felt more like a cage than a luxury. As the door clicked shut, the silence inside the cabin was a stark contrast to the buzzing of her smartphone, which was currently being analyzed. Every notification, every private message, and every frantic call from her staff was now being cataloged by the forensic team at the Bureau. She realized with a jolt of pure terror that her entire digital existence was being stripped bare by people who viewed her as a criminal. The drive toward her apartment was a slow trek through a city that would soon wake up to the most explosive scandal in modern history. She watched the lights of the Capitol building glow in the distance, knowing she would never walk those hallowed halls as a member again. The prestige, the influence, and the sheer rush of being at the center of the political universe had evaporated in a few hours of questioning. How had she let the greed of the lifestyle she once mocked become the very thing that led to her inevitable and total downfall? The irony of a socialist champion being undone by the pursuit of offshore millions was a script even her worst enemies couldn't have written. "We need the access codes for the Future Holdings encrypted server by midnight," the agent in the front seat said without looking back. His voice was dry and transactional, a sign that he viewed her not as a person, but as a source of raw data and evidence. I already told you, Riley has the master keys for the secondary encryption layer, she replied, her voice sounding thin and utterly defeated. The agent made a quick note on his tablet, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen as they navigated through traffic. Then you'd better hope he's as cooperative as you are when we pick him up at the airport in the next 20 minutes. The mention of Riley sent a fresh wave of nausea through her, a mixture of guilt for his involvement and anger at his sloppy mistakes. They had built their little empire on the idea that they were smarter than the system, that their moral cause shielded them from scrutiny. But the system didn't care about her speeches or her millions of followers when it came to a simple trail of missing tax dollars. Every fancy dinner, every private jet flight, and every designer item was a breadcrumb that had led the wolf directly to her door. She closed her eyes, trying to imagine the headlines that would dominate every television screen and newsfeed for the next several months. Inside the FBI headquarters, the mood was electric as teams of investigators began cross-referencing her confession with years of intercepted data. They were mapping out the Green Shadow Network, a web of nonprofits and consulting firms that functioned as a giant laundering machine. Donations would enter a primary fund, be split into smaller operating expenses, and then disappear into a labyrinth of subcontracted services. The genius of the plan was its simplicity, but the flaw was the human element, the pride that led her to keep meticulous records of her status. They found a private cloud folder titled The Legacy, which contained photos of her and Riley at villas they officially claimed they never visited. By 2:00 a.m., the first leaks began to hit the major news outlets, starting with a cryptic tweet from a high-level source at the Justice Department. A massive shakeup is coming to the House. Expect a vacancy in New York's 14th District by sunrise, the Post read, sparking instant speculation. AOC's media team, unaware of the meeting in the Oval Office, spent the night trying to reach her, their panic growing with every unanswered call. They had no idea that their boss was currently sitting in a sterile room, detailing how she used their salaries to fund her secret investments. The transition from a loyal political family to a group of suspects and witnesses was happening in real time under the harsh fluorescent lights. In a secure room, Director Wray watched the interrogation through a one-way mirror, his arms crossed as he listened to her list the names of co-conspirators. "She's giving up everyone," he noted to the accountant standing beside him, who was busy highlighting a new list of shell companies. "She knows the president isn't bluffing about the life sentence, so she's doing the only thing a career politician knows how to do. She's pivoting to save herself, even if it means burning down the entire movement she helped build from the ground up." The accountant nodded, pointing to a wire transfer for $400,000 that had just been traced to a luxury real estate developer. As the sun began to rise over the Potomac, the White House press secretary prepared a brief statement that would change the course of the election cycle. The news broke at 6:01 a.m. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had resigned from Congress effective immediately and was cooperating with a federal corruption probe. The internet exploded in a frenzy of shock, disbelief, and partisan warfare as the details of the $847,000 transfer were finally made public. Her supporters felt a deep, visceral sense of betrayal, while her detractors celebrated what they saw as the ultimate validation of their long-held suspicions. The girl from the Bronx was now the face of elite corruption, her image forever tied to the very swamp she promised to drain. Back at her apartment, which was now crawling with federal agents executing a search warrant, AOC sat on her sofa watching her own downfall. She saw the clips of her past speeches being played alongside the evidence of her fraud, a montage of hypocrisy that was physically painful to watch. The agents were boxing up her designer shoes, her high-end electronics, and folders of documents she thought were hidden in a secure safe. "I need to call my mother," she said to no one in particular, but the agent standing by the door simply shook his head slowly. No outside contact until the initial processing is complete, per the agreement you signed last night with the President and the Bureau. The walls of her carefully constructed world had completely collapsed, leaving her exposed to the cold, unforgiving reality of the American legal system. In the coming weeks, there would be court appearances, depositions, and the grueling process of liquidating her assets to pay back the stolen funds. The luxury she had grown to crave would be replaced by the Spartan reality of legal defense meetings and the constant threat of a prison cell. She had traded her integrity for a few years of high living, and now the bill had finally come due with a crushing interest rate. The story of her rise was legendary, but the story of her fall would be a cautionary tale for generations of politicians to come. Trump, meanwhile, sat in the dining room off the Oval Office, sipping a Diet Coke as he watched the news coverage with a satisfied grin. He had neutralized one of his most vocal critics, not through a debate or an election, but through the cold, hard application of the law. "I told them she was a fake," he muttered to an aide, "but even I didn't think she was this bad at hiding the money." He knew this was just the beginning. The Green Shadow investigation would likely lead to more names, more arrests, and more political chaos. The era of AOC was over, and the era of the Great Accountability had just begun, leaving the rest of Washington wondering who would be next. The federal transport van felt like a rolling tomb as it navigated the early morning streets of D.C., heading toward a secure holding facility. Alexandria stared at the floor, unable to look at the city she had once dreamed of leading from the highest office in the land. Every streetlight that passed was a reminder of the thousands of eyes that would now be judging her every move for years to come. She thought of the social media posts she had drafted just yesterday, full of fire and defiance against the very establishment that now owned her. The disconnect between her public persona and the woman sitting in this armored vehicle was a chasm that could never be bridged again. The facility they arrived at was a nondescript brick building, far from the cameras and the frantic crowds gathering at the Capitol steps. Inside, the air was clinical and smelled of industrial cleaner, a scent that would become the primary olfactory backdrop of her new reality. They didn't put her in a general cell, but the small interrogation room was no less confining with its bolted furniture and gray walls. A lone camera in the corner blinked a steady, rhythmic red, recording every flinch and every tear for the Federal Archives and the prosecutors. She was given a glass of lukewarm tap water and told to wait while the final details of her cooperation agreement were being processed. 2 hours later, a legal team she didn't recognize entered the room, led by a man with a face as hard as a granite mountain. He was a court-appointed liaison, though it was clear he was there primarily to ensure she didn't deviate from the deal she made with Trump. "The President has authorized a special fast track for your asset forfeiture to minimize the public spectacle," the lawyer said, opening a laptop. "We need you to provide the biometric bypass for the Future Holdings physical hardware wallet located in your Manhattan residence immediately. If you provide it now, we can avoid a forced entry team destroying the property, which is already slated for immediate government auction." She gave them the code, her voice a hollow shell of its former self, feeling another piece of her secret life being stripped away. That hardware wallet held the keys to nearly $4 million in various cryptocurrencies, the digital nest egg she thought was her ultimate safety net. As the lawyer typed, she realized that within minutes, those funds would be frozen and transferred to a Department of Justice recovery account. The luxury condo, the offshore accounts, and the digital wealth were all dissolving, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back. The realization of her total poverty was almost as staggering as the realization of her impending loss of personal and physical freedom. Meanwhile, back in New York's 14th district, the atmosphere was one of absolute chaos and a sense of profound, stinging community betrayal. Constituents who had canvassed for her in the rain were now tearing down her posters and throwing her campaign merch into the trash. The local offices were shuttered, guarded by police, as angry crowds gathered to demand answers that no one on her staff was able to give. Her chief of staff, now a primary witness for the prosecution, was being moved to a safe house after receiving a dozen death threats. The movement she claimed was unsold had been revealed as a meticulously marketed product designed to enrich a small, secretive group of elites. The FBI's Forensic Accounting Division worked through the night, uncovering a secondary layer of fraud involving community outreach grants. They found that AOC had approved payments to a series of shell nonprofits that existed only as billing addresses in various suburban strip malls. These entities would invoice her campaign for consulting and voter data, but the money would immediately be converted into gold bullion. Over $2 million in gold had been purchased over 18 months and stored in private vaults that were now being raided by agents. The level of premeditation was staggering, showing a woman who wasn't just skimming off the top, but was actively gutting the treasury. By noon on the second day, the first set of leaked photos from the investigation began to circulate on every major news network globally. One photo showed a secret closet in her D.C. apartment filled with designer handbags that cost more than most of her voters made in a year. Another was a screen capture of a bank transfer titled "Birthday Gift," which moved $50,000 to her brother's personal checking account. The public's fascination with her fall was morbid and relentless, fueled by the sheer scale of the hypocrisy she had displayed daily. Late-night talk shows, once her biggest cheerleaders, now used her as the punchline for every monologue about political greed and systemic corruption. In the White House, Donald Trump watched the ratings for the news coverage with a sense of grim, professional satisfaction and personal vindication. He knew that this wasn't just about one congresswoman, it was a lethal blow to the entire political movement she had come to represent. The bigger they are, the harder they fall, and she was the biggest of them all, he remarked to his national security advisor. He had already planned a primetime address to the nation to discuss the restoration of integrity and the end of the radical grift. The script was being written to frame this as a victory for the forgotten man over the corrupt, self-serving elites of the New Left. Back in the interrogation room, AOC was shown a video of her mother being questioned by reporters outside her home in Westchester. The elderly woman looked confused and heartbroken, unable to reconcile the daughter she raised with the criminal being described on the news. "Did you know about the money, Mrs. Ocasio?" a reporter shouted, thrusting a microphone into her face as she tried to reach her car. Alexandria turned her head away from the screen, the guilt finally manifesting as a physical pain in her chest that made it hard to breathe. She had destroyed her family's name and her mother's peace of mind for the sake of a lifestyle she couldn't even enjoy. The lead FBI investigator, a woman named Miller, who had spent her career chasing Wall Street sharks, sat down across from her. "You're not a revolutionary, Alexandria," Miller said quietly. "You're just a very talented actress who forgot that the play eventually ends. We have the statements from the decorators who worked on your secret Miami villa, and they've all identified you as the primary payer. They even remembered you complaining that the marble wasn't expensive enough for the master bathroom, which is a very interesting detail. We're going to find every single cent, and we're going to make sure you never see a dime of it ever again." As the evening of the second day approached, the legal reality of her situation became a set of cold, hard, and undeniable numbers. The prosecution was offering a plea deal, 20 years in a minimum security facility in exchange for full testimony against her entire network. If she refused, they were prepared to go to trial with a mountain of evidence that carried a potential sentence of over 100 years. Her lawyers advised her that a trial would be a suicide mission given the digital trail and the number of co-conspirators who had flipped. She was a woman who had once stood on the world stage, now reduced to haggling over the remaining decades of her natural life. She signed the plea agreement at 8:45 p.m., the scratch of the pen on the paper sounding like a final, definitive closing of a door. The deal required her to record a video confession that would be released to the public as part of a government transparency initiative. She spent the next hour under a makeup artist's care, not to look beautiful, but to look remorseful and humble for the camera's lens. The irony of being styled for her own public execution was not lost on her, but she was too exhausted to care about the optics anymore. The lens flared to life, and for the first time in her life, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez spoke the absolute, unvarnished, and ugly truth. "I lied to you," she began, her voice steady but devoid of its usual rhythmic cadence and political energy. "I took the money you worked for, and I spent it on a life I didn't earn and didn't deserve to lead at your expense. I am a fraud, and I accept the consequences of my actions and the judgment of the people I have so deeply betrayed." The video would go on to be the most watched piece of political content in history, a digital epitaph for a career that burned out in a scandal. As the camera turned off, she was led away to a waiting cell, the sounds of her own heels clicking on the concrete floor. The trial of the century wouldn't be a trial at all, but a long, slow process of dismantling an entire political infrastructure. In the weeks that followed, dozens of other activists and consultants were arrested as the Green Shadow investigation expanded. The shockwaves hit the financial markets, the political establishment, and the very fabric of American trust in their elected officials. AOC became a ghost, a name mentioned only in the past tense, or as a warning to those who sought power for the wrong reasons. The girl who wanted to change the world had succeeded, but in a way that would leave the world more cynical and divided than ever before. The heavy steel door of the Federal Processing Center groaned as it swung shut, marking the official end of Alexandria's life as a free citizen. The transition from the velvet-lined corridors of power to the cold, antiseptic reality of a holding cell was a shock to her entire system. She was stripped of her designer blazer and her jewelry, replaced by a stiff, oversized jumpsuit that smelled of cheap detergent and despair. Every luxury she had once taken for granted was now a distant memory, replaced by the crushing weight of institutionalized silence and routine. The fame that had once been her greatest weapon had now become a unique kind of torment in this windowless, gray environment. The first night was an endless cycle of intrusive thoughts and the muffled sounds of a facility that never truly goes to sleep. She stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the plaster, as if they were a map to a world that no longer existed for her. She thought about the thousands of small-dollar donors who had sent their hard-earned money to a cause they believed was pure and righteous. The image of a single mother in Ohio sending $20 while Alexandria bought a $500 bottle of wine burned in her mind. The hypocrisy wasn't just a political talking point anymore. It was a physical sensation of rot that seemed to settle deep in her bones. In the outside world, the Department of Justice was executing a massive coordinated sweep of every entity linked to the Green Shadow network. Federal marshals seized high-end real estate in Brooklyn, luxury vehicles in D.C., and several private storage units filled with high-value assets. The investigation revealed that the corruption wasn't just a side project, but was actually the primary engine of her entire political operation. They discovered a membership club where wealthy donors could buy private access to her for six-figure sums, disguised as legitimate campaign contributions. The records showed that these donations were immediately laundered through a series of offshore gaming sites to obscure their original source. The media coverage turned into a 24-hour autopsy of her career, dissecting every speech and every public appearance for signs of the hidden grift. Body language experts analyzed her old interviews, pointing out the subtle tells and nervous tics she displayed when lying about her finances. Former staffers began coming forward with stories of her demanding nature and the secret instructions she gave to keep the books creative. They described an environment of fear and absolute loyalty, where any questioning of the financial structure resulted in immediate termination and blacklisting. The charismatic leader the public saw was revealed to be a cold, calculating manager who treated her movement like a personal piggy bank. By the end of the first week, the FBI had successfully cracked the encryption on her primary communication server, revealing years of incriminating data. The messages between her and Riley Roberts showed a level of arrogance that shocked even the most cynical investigators in the Bureau's ranks. "The peasants love the new climate video," one message read, "and the fertilizer is flowing into the future holdings account faster than we can track." They joked about the simplicity of the scam and the gullibility of the people who saw them as the vanguard of a new moral revolution. These transcripts were leaked to the press, causing a second wave of public outrage that crossed all traditional political and social lines. Trump utilized the scandal to launch a sweeping executive order aimed at transitional transparency within all congressional fundraising and spending. He framed the AOC case as the ultimate proof that the entire system was rigged by those who shouted the loudest about social justice. "She told you she was the solution," he said during a massive rally in Pennsylvania, "but she was actually the most expensive problem in history." The crowd's roar was a deafening reminder of how quickly the tide had turned against the woman who was once the darling of the media. The political landscape was being reshaped in real time as other politicians scrambled to distance themselves from her and her now poisonous brand. Inside the facility, Alexandria was brought into a small room to meet with the forensic team responsible for liquidating her stolen assets. They presented her with a list of properties and accounts that were being seized under the terms of her signed cooperation agreement. "You're looking at a total forfeiture of approximately $22 million, the lead agent said, sliding a thick document across the table. "That includes the Miami villa, the Manhattan penthouse, the gold bullion, and all offshore accounts we've identified in the Caribbean and Europe." She looked at the total and felt a strange sense of detachment, as if they were talking about a game of Monopoly rather than her life. "What happens if I don't sign this?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would be her certain and final destruction. "Then the deal is void. You go to a maximum security prison, and we take it all anyway through the courts over the next decade. The difference is that now you have a chance to show some shred of remorse, which might help you during your eventual sentencing hearing." She signed the papers, her signature once again acting as the final nail in the coffin of the empire she had built on lies. The agent took the papers and left without a word, leaving her alone with the realization that she was now effectively a penniless ward of the state. The news of the total forfeiture hit the headlines within the hour, providing a sense of closure to the millions of people who felt cheated. The AOC Fund for Restitution was established by the government to return a portion of the stolen money to the original small-dollar donors. Thousands of people signed up to reclaim their $5 and $10 contributions, a symbolic act of reclaiming their power from a false idol. The image of the restoration became a powerful narrative of justice being served to those who thought they were above the common man. The once mighty social media influencer was now reduced to a case study in a textbook about the dangers of unchecked political narcissism. As her formal sentencing date approached, Alexandria spent her time writing letters to her mother, most of which were never actually mailed. She struggled to explain how she had lost her way, how the lure of the spotlight and the easy money had blinded her to her own values. She saw her own face on the small, grainy television in the common area, but she no longer recognized the woman she had once been. The fire was gone, replaced by a weary acceptance of the long, cold years that lay ahead of her in the federal prison system. The story of the girl who wanted to save the world had ended in a cell, surrounded by the silence of her own making. The heavy steel door of the Federal Processing Center groaned as it swung shut, marking the official end of Alexandria's life as a free citizen. The transition from the velvet-lined corridors of power to the cold, antiseptic reality of a holding cell was a shock to her entire system. She was stripped of her designer blazer and her jewelry, replaced by a stiff, oversized jumpsuit that smelled of cheap detergent and despair. Every luxury she had once taken for granted was now a distant memory, replaced by the crushing weight of institutionalized silence and routine. The fame that had once been her greatest weapon had now become a unique kind of torment in this windowless, gray environment. The first night was an endless cycle of intrusive thoughts and the muffled sounds of a facility that never truly goes to sleep. She stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the plaster as if they were a map to a world that no longer existed for her. She thought about the thousands of small-dollar donors who had sent their hard-earned money to a cause they believed was pure and righteous. The image of a single mother in Ohio, sending $20, while Alexandria bought a $500 bottle of wine, burned in her mind. The hypocrisy wasn't just a political talking point anymore. It was a physical sensation of rot that seemed to settle deep in her bones. In the outside world, the Department of Justice was executing a massive coordinated sweep of every entity linked to the Green Shadow Network. Federal marshals seized high-end real estate in Brooklyn, luxury vehicles in D.C., and several private storage units filled with high-value assets. The investigation revealed that the corruption wasn't just a side project, but was actually the primary engine of her entire political operation. They discovered a membership club where wealthy donors could buy private access to her for six-figure sums, disguised as legitimate campaign contributions. The records showed that these donations were immediately laundered through a series of offshore gaming sites to obscure their original source. The media coverage turned into a 24-hour autopsy of her career, dissecting every speech and every public appearance for